Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions, those that will also be today with us in the C-SPAN audience. For those here in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And of course, for those watching online, you are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And following today's presentation, you may also review the program on the Heritage homepage as well. Leading our discussion is Romina Baccia. She is our Grover M. Herman Research Fellow in Federal Budgetary Affairs and Deputy Director of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. Her research and writing centers on controlling government spending and waste, eliminating corporate welfare, and reforming Social Security. She's advised members of Congress, testified on the Hill as well. Prior to joining us here in 2011, she was a policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum and covered regulatory issues involving labor, the internet, and energy policy. Please join me in welcoming Romina Baccia. Romina?
Good afternoon. It is my distinguished pleasure to welcome you to the Heritage Foundation today to discuss a very timely and also a very critical issue, and that is controlling our national debt. Next Monday, on April 9th, the Congressional Budget Office will release its budget and economic outlook, presenting Congress with a scorecard of sorts for how recent fiscal decisions have impacted the 10-year outlook for the United States. The agency will then report revised figures for the deficit, the national debt, federal spending, and revenues, and they will also include projections for interest as well as the rate of growth for the economy. And all of these projections will account for the recent tax cuts as well as the massive spending increase that Congress just passed into law with the omnibus bill. And a damning score it will be indeed. If lawmakers were in school, they'd surely be getting a failing grade. Today's purpose, however, is not for us to wallow together in fiscal misery, but to look ahead boldly and optimistically at ways and tools that we can use to gain control of the U.S. fiscal situation and to improve our lot going forward. And we'll be looking for this to our sister republic, Switzerland, for guidance. It is my distinguished privilege to introduce our panel today that will be leading the discussion. Professor Jan Egbert-Storm joins us from Switzerland, where he was chairman of the Swiss Debt Break Group of Experts for the Swiss government. He's also director of the KfF Swiss Economic Institute at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and professor of applied macroeconomics at the ETH Zurich. Professor Storm will kick off today's discussion with a presentation on the Swiss debt break. Afterwards, we'll have a lively discussion, including Professor Barry Paulson, who joins us from Colorado, which arguably has one of the most effective spending and debt rules in the United States, the Tabor Rule. Dr. Paulson is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Colorado, and I'd also like to mention two books that he's co-authored, which are particularly relevant for today's discussion. The first, Can the Debt Growth Be Stopped? Rules-Based Policy Options for Addressing the Federal Fiscal Crisis, and Restoring America's Fiscal Constitution. And we're also joined by Ryan Bourne, who's the R. Evan Scharf Chair for the Public Understanding of Economics at the Cato Institute. Before joining Cato, Bourne was head of public policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs and head of economic research at the Center for Policy Studies, both of which are located in the United Kingdom. Bourne recently completed a review of fiscal rules, and he will share his insights in the broader global context. My name is Romina Baccia. I'm the Grover M. Herman Research Fellow in Federal Budgetary Affairs here at the Heritage Foundation, and I recently returned from Switzerland, where I had the honor of meeting with the economists at the Swiss government that administer the Swiss debt brake. And I cannot wait to share with you the incredible success of this fiscal rule and the potential it offers for the United States. So thank you so much for joining us here online and also on C-SPAN. And it is with great pleasure that I now invite Professor Storm to share his presentation with us. Professor Storm?
Thank you. Thank you a lot. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to spend some time with you trying to, first of all, explain the Swiss debt brake. How does it work? And then perhaps, if time allows, I'll be short in general, if time allows, also to look with you what the current discussions are in Switzerland with respect to the debt brake. And you will notice that we're actually, well, way ahead as compared to many other countries. We're discussing what I would consider a luxuriety problem. We're considering the situation as of how to deal with surpluses. Yes. All right, but let's first look at the Swiss debt brake itself. Where does it come from? And let me put this a bit in perspective, comparing this with other nations. Here I show you the general government gross debt for the United States, a share of GDP. And as you can see, it basically, since the early 2000s, has increased, reaching relatively high levels above 100% of GDP nowadays. In comparison, this is the European situation. If you add up all the debt situations in the European countries, the EU 27, you see this particular picture. The forecasts are the forecasts of the IMF currently, so they hope or they think that indeed in Europe there will be a slow decline now coming. That's not the same here for the United States. In comparison to all of that, this is the situation in Switzerland. We didn't see the uplift which basically almost all countries, almost all Western countries have seen. We actually saw a further decline. It's a rather stable debt to GDP ratio with a tendency of slowly falling. This is for the general government. So what I'll be explaining the Swiss debt brake for the federal government. Yes, because the Swiss system is as such that there are big differences between the federal level and the cantonal level or even the municipality level. My presentation will concentrate upon the federal level. For the general government, so the three layers altogether, we have a debt GDP ratio of roughly 40% of GDP. If I go to the situation for the central government, and actually this is 15%, so you see most of the debt is actually cantonal or municipality debt. Here we see from a somewhat longer perspective the situation in Switzerland since 1990. We've seen the debt to GDP ratio started falling basically in 2004. The Swiss debt brake was implemented in 2003. Yes, and hence, for many people, the success story of this falling debt to GDP ratio is very much related to this debt brake. As you can also see in the 90s, we had a steep increase, at least from a Swiss perspective, a steep increase. The 90s started with a real estate crisis, and this actually led to all kinds of problems in Switzerland. Some talk about the lost decade in the 90s, and we see what happened also with the central government debt, a steady increase in that sense. And then politicians started to worry. Voters started to worry, how is it going to end and what can we do about that? And through years of discussion, they basically designed a debt brake which was being proposed to the population, to the voters, the Swiss voters, through a referendum in 2001. And in 2001, 85% of the population voted in favor of the debt brake. I think that's the most important aspect to take away from my lecture, I would say. This debt brake is not only something which the politicians like, but it's actually something which is rooted inside the Swiss population. 85% of the population in favor of this kind of rule. And it's still more or less like that. If you ask people on the street, do you know about the Swiss debt brake? Most would say yes, and think that it's actually a very good idea. Here we see the nominal figures which go with the debt to GDP ratio itself. And the little green bars, which I'm showing you on this slide, I'm going to talk about later on a little bit, because it highlights as of how the government deals with the fact that we are currently seeing a declining debt to GDP ratio and a declining nominal debt itself. So let me try to explain to you how the debt brake mechanism in Switzerland works. It's actually pretty straightforward. You can actually use one very simple formula and one general rule, namely that the expenditures of the government may not exceed the receipts over an economic cycle. Yes, so they look at the tax revenues or the total revenues of the government. They correct for the business cycle in these tax revenues, and that defines basically what the maximum amount of spending in a country can be like, or in Switzerland can be like by the federal state. From an economist, the biggest problem might be how to calculate what trend GDP is, what potential GDP is. And also here, the Swiss are very pragmatic. They simply said, well, we use a filter which everyone uses, the Hodrick-Prescott filter. That's basically being applied here. They know of the difficulties surrounding with that, but the way the rule is being designed, it's actually relatively robust to this type of filter which is being used. Yes. This also implies that by construction, the automatic stabilizers in the Swiss federal system work through the revenue side, first of all. Yes, taxes are allowed to be higher during boom phases and lower during recessionary phases. On the spending side, however, we do not really allow these kind of cyclical variation. The spending side is basically a trend development, and that's basically what this graph shows us. This graph basically shows what's happening overall with respect to the debt break situation. Of course, you might say, well, there are components inside spending which are very cyclical. And indeed, in particular, the social insurance system, unemployment insurance system, is kept out of this particular Swiss debt break. That's basically kept in a different account because we know that it's very cyclical. In a downturn, there are more people unemployed, so the social security system needs additional money. But we have an additional, more or less, debt break system working on that as well. Yeah, so if there the money is too low or the debt for the social insurance side is increasing, then at some stage there will be an automatic increase in the social security premium. So also that is in that sense being solved, but we do see that their cyclicality is allowed for. What do the Swiss do if somehow it turns out to be the case that actual expenditure is not the same as the revenues or the business cycle corrected revenues? Well, if that's the case, then they have the so-called compensation account, yes? Meaning that if it turns out to be the case that expenditure is higher than what the revenues should allow for, then this deficit or this increased spending is being noted on this particular account, and then there are rules at stake how quickly that has to be paid back. Yes? In general, one can say within a period of 3 years of time, at least on the compensation account, that money has to be financed again. What has happened since the introduction of the Swiss debt brake is the opposite, namely that they are running, at least with hindsight, surpluses. The budgets were balanced, yes, so the budgets were perfectly balanced, so to speak, but after the actual spending year is over, the fiscal year is over, they realized that they haven't used up the entire budget, so there is a surplus ex post. And this ex post surplus is also being registered in this compensation account. It's actually formally being used to pay back the debt, but there is this notional account in which that's being registered. And actually on the previous slide, that's this one. That's basically these green bars which you see at the bottom. That's the increase of this notional compensation account, which is being a part of the system. Okay. What happens if there are extreme events? Well, actually, also that's allowed for. There are escapes clause, so to speak. You need a majority, a qualified majority in the two chambers to actually get that working. But in particular situations, it is allowed for that in 1 year, because of exceptional situations, there is a deficit. Also, there are rules how quickly that has to be paid back, so we know what the consequences of all of that are. Well, what's the current? Well, that's more or less in a nutshell how this debt brake works. It's that simple, and I think a big advantage of this particular system is its simplicity. People understand what's happening. Simply spending can't be more than what you earn. It's that simple, and that's what's being noted in this particular rule. As I said, we are currently in a situation, or the last year since the introduction at least, but even before that, that the country is running ex post surpluses. So we have seen in one of the first slides I showed you, we've seen that the debt is falling, but this was not planned in that sense. The budget were balanced, so in principle, the nominal debt should have been constant. With hindsight ex post, it actually fell. This is not something new. We actually see that also before the debt break. These blue bars show that even in the mid-90s, when we see the accumulation of the debt, even there, the ex-post accounts look better than the budgeted accounts. Yes. So hence, this seems to be, at least to some extent, part of how the system works, part how the bureaucracy works. They are, well, over carefully, so to speak, in their budgeting process, and at the end of the day, they still have a little bit of money left. Yes. And that's actually what last year the discussion was about. Is this a good thing to have? Ex ante, a balanced budget, and ex post a surplus. And we as the Commission from the federal government have been talking about that. And the summary of that report I can basically put down here. At this stage, we do not think that it's a good thing to change this particular Swiss debt break rule. Also because the population would find it difficult to understand why these rules are being changed. The rule now is being accepted by a broad public, and changing it too quickly, too soon, is something we would hesitate from. If, however, and that's my final sentence, if, however, these surpluses would persist even in the future, and we don't think that that's going to be the case for all kinds of technical reasons, maybe in the discussion we can talk about that, but if they would persist, then we actually believe that this would be more a reason to cut the tax side, the revenue side, so to speak, instead of increasing the spending side, because we do believe that the actual spending at the end of the year is more representative of what's socially optimal than the budgeted expenditures. Okay, I'll end here, and I'll give the floor back to Romina.
Thank you very much. You'll join us for the Very, very interesting presentation. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us, and I'm sure there's more that we'll explore during this panel discussion portion. I want to give Barry and Ryan just a chance maybe to react and share a few thoughts following the presentation, and then I'll ask a couple specific questions. Either of you care to?
Sure, I'll jump in. I agree with John Egbert's assessment of the Swiss debt break. I think it's very successful because of the reasons he's explained. Very clear goals, very clear rules that are enforced rather automatically through the debt break. And obviously, they've introduced budget process rules that make this effective. But I also agree with the more important statement that he made earlier in his talk, in which he said, if you really want to understand why the Swiss debt break works, you need to understand Swiss institutions. The Swiss have developed dynamic credence capital. In Switzerland, there are no bailouts. There's a no bailout rule that operates at every level of government. And so every government at the cantonal level, the municipal level, the federal level, knows they have a hard budget constraint. Now that gets your attention, because if you have a hard budget constraint, then you have an incentive to introduce effective rules, which is exactly what they did. And the second part of the institutional framework, which I think is crucial, as John Egbert mentioned, is direct democracy. They passed the Swiss debt break. It was first of all passed at the cantonal level, clear back in the 1980s, as I understand. And it was passed through initiative referendum, which means that the citizens support this kind of fiscal discipline. And it operated successfully in several cantons. Other cantons copied this Swiss debt break. And then eventually in the 1990s, they enacted the Swiss debt break at the federal level. So the Swiss rely very heavily on initiative and referendum, which means that Swiss citizens vote on tax and debt, hundreds of measures every year at the cantonal level and at the federal level. And it's that Swiss citizen support for fiscal discipline and fiscal rules embodied in their constitution through a referendum with 85% support. That is the most important reason why it works. I think it's also important to emphasize that Switzerland has probably the most effective federalist system in the world. Most of their decisions, tax and spending decisions, are made at the local level, the cantonal level, and the municipal level. They have perhaps the weakest federal government in the OECD countries. That's really important because it means that citizens have direct control over these tax decisions, debt decisions. They hold legislators accountable at all levels of government, and they can hold their feet to the fire in a way that we can't. So our fundamental problem in this country is we bail out everybody. Everybody expects to get bailed out. Local governments expect to get bailed out by the state government. State governments get bailed out by the federal government. And the federal government, of course, continues to shovel money to bail out both the private and the public sector. So if there's one thing we need, it's a no bailout rule, which is the foundation, in my view, for their success.
Thank you, Barry. Ryan, would you like to
Yeah,
share
sure.
some thoughts?
I totally agree with Barry, and I don't think you can divorce what's happened in Switzerland in terms of the specific rule from the institutional and political consensus that has developed in that country. One thing that struck me looking at the experience of fiscal rules all around the world, and if you think through history, fiscal rules on their own are neither necessary nor sufficient for good fiscal outcomes. Notionally, the EU had its Maastricht criteria for debt and deficits. That didn't really do much good sailing into the Eurozone crisis. And if you look at the US's history, the federal government's history, there was no fiscal rule prior to the 1930s, but by and large, politicians took it upon themselves to try to balance the books. So I don't think you can divorce this from the political consensus that Switzerland has created for fiscal discipline. I think that's the first point I'd like to make. But there are certain aspects of the rule that I think really do lend itself to better outcomes and avoid some of the gamesmanship, the creative accounting that you get when lots of other countries attempt to enforce rules on deficits or spending or debt. I think the first point is that there's provisions in this rule with the compensating accounts to not allow bygones to be bygones. If deficits overshoot targets, then they're compensated for in future years. There's so many different countries, and I imagine lots of you have familiarity with states as well, who notionally on paper say that they're going to balance the budget and get to the end of the year and say, oh, we're surprised, we overborrowed relative to targets, and then go through the next year and do exactly the same thing again. So it's very, very important to have that mechanism in there to not allow bygones to be bygones. And if you do actually borrow and government spending does exceed tax revenues, that's compensated for by adjusting the framework for spending in future years. The second point that I'd make is lots of countries around the world implement a very similar fiscal rule, but trying to base spending or cap spending on potential revenues, which is predicated on potential GDP estimates. I think what's crucial about the Swiss rule in comparison to other countries and why it's been more successful is that to a much larger extent, the Swiss rule relies on hard data. It puts in data for what has happened in previous years in terms of trend growth, and it has very near-term estimates of what real GDP growth is going to be in the coming year. It's much easier, and the forecasting record for that is much better than trying to ascertain some notion of what the potential growth of the economy is, particularly in the post-crisis period. Lots of economists around the world have got substantial egg on their faces when they've tried to predict what the potential growth of economies have been. So linking it to real data that can't be adjusted or can't be estimated in an over-optimistic sense, I think is a crucial difference between the Swiss rule and the rule of other countries like Chile, which was successful up to a time, but then has had found it far more difficult to balance its books in the post-crisis period when potential GDP has been much more difficult to forecast. So I think those two, no bygones being bygones, is a crucial part of the rule, but also the rule is based on much less speculative data than many other countries. So I'll just stop there for now, and then we can go to specific questions.
Thank you. My first question has to do with another institutional mechanism, and that is how the Swiss pay their taxes compared to how we pay our federal taxes in the United States. And the tax due date in the United States is just about here. What I understand from Switzerland is that there is no automatic income tax withholding, but that the Swiss actually have to file their taxes, I believe, is it 3 times a year? and then have to actually send a check or pay their taxes at their cantonal office. Do you think that that has anything to do with popular support for fiscal responsibility and for also for the Swiss debt break, that mechanism of how people interact with their government through the taxing mechanism?
Yeah, I think that's indeed a good example, because what's very important in Switzerland, people realize that the taxes they pay are there to supply public goods, so to speak. So, and that it starts at the municipality level. You not only pay federal taxes or cantonal taxes, but also municipality taxes. And if they, for instance, need a new swimming pool or something like that, then it's very clear that this has implications for the taxes which are being paid. So they really see a clear link between what they get from the public sector and what they pay for that, so to speak. And indeed, the way in which they pay taxes makes that also probably more visible than in other countries is very often the situation. Yeah.
Romina, if I could add it, my understanding also is that tax increases can only be initiated at the cantonal level, not at the federal level. So the federal government cannot propose a tax, is my understanding. It depends upon the types of taxes you're talking about. Yes, so value-added taxes, for instance, is something which is being done by the federal level, but the income taxes, well, it depends. Yes, but indeed, it's not very easy for politicians, especially at the federal level, to change the revenue side substantially. Yes. So if they want to see an increase in revenue, then it's very likely that they will have to go through a referendum procedure, and hence the people have to vote about that.
On a point that Ryan made about not letting bygones be bygones, and you talked about the notional accounts, that the compensation accounts showing a surplus now, it made me think of a fiscal rule we have in the United States called the pay-go rule, which is supposed to act similarly in that we keep a record of when we initiate new mandatory spending for social programs, entitlement programs, and the like, and also for tax cuts. However, in the United States, what we find is that that rule is regularly, if not always, waived. So what is different about Switzerland? Is it harder to get around? Is it harder to allow for this type of emergency spending or to waive the fiscal rule? What would it take to do so? Or is it that there's more public pressure, perhaps, and attention paid to what Swiss politicians are doing that is keeping them in check? What makes them abide by the rule?
Yeah, I think it's partly, of course, what is being required legally, so to speak. They have to have a qualified majority, so many parties in all the two chambers within the government system at the federal level have to agree upon that this is an exceptional situation. And I think, again, most importantly, society must really accept this as well. If they have the feeling that this is just an excuse for something, then this is not going to bite. This is not going to work out. Society will somehow make it clear that these rules are being, well, obeyed, so to speak. So I think for me, I'm also an outsider from Switzerland. I'm living there now for 12 years or 13 years by now, but coming from the Netherlands myself, for me, the most astonishing fact of Switzerland is indeed this direct democracy, this fact that politicians not only discuss plans, ideas with other politicians within their party or in other parties, but they also always realize that if this is a substantial reform, they will have to go through the referendum system. They will have to put this at vote straight away, so to speak, or straight away. It actually takes quite some time before that happens, but they know that any compromise from a political point of view is not sufficient. It also has to be, well, carried or being seen as necessary by the people itself.
Barry, you looked at possible ways to apply sort of a Swiss-style debt break in your book on Can the Debt Growth Be Stopped? What is your assessment on current fiscal rules that we have, and how would a Swiss-style debt break be different, and would there be different incentives as well, perhaps not to forgo the rule as much, or how do you see this?
Well, thank you. My colleague and I decided several years ago to ask this question: what would the U.S. look like with a Swiss debt break? And we designed a dynamic simulation model to actually estimate the impact of a Swiss-type debt break on the U.S. And the first thing we did was to fit this model over an historical period, a 2-decade period. What if we had introduced the debt brake in 1992? And that was sort of encouraging because we set targets similar to the Swiss. We wanted to balance the budget within 2 decades. We wanted to get the debt to GDP ratio down to a sustainable level. And we showed that you could do that. You would have to have more stringent controls on spending. You'd have to reduce spending growth over that period about 1.5%, 2%. But that's very doable. And you would also have to reform entitlements programs. So we were sort of encouraged by that initial work. Then we applied our model over the forecast period using CBO data for the next 2 decades. What if we introduce a debt brake? And I can tell you that's very discouraging. It is going to be very difficult. We can get to a balanced budget in 2 decades. We can get the debt to GDP ratio below 60% within 2 decades. But it's going to take a very stringent fiscal rule, an expenditure rule similar to the one we have in Colorado, where we limit the growth of spending to inflation and population growth, which is more stringent than the Swiss rule. And we introduced a Swiss-type debt brake where if the deficits exceed a level or the debt exceeds a level, we reduce spending even further. And of course, over the next 2 decades, all we're forecasting is deficits and debt. So we'd have to reduce the spending even further, applying a Swiss-type debt brake. In fact, what we estimate is that we would have to reduce discretionary spending to less than 1% growth per year. But on top of that, we'd have to generate about $700 billion every year for the next 2 decades in savings to get that debt ratio down. Now, where do you get by the way, that's double what the CBO estimates the fiscal gap to be. So where would you get $700 billion a year? Obviously, entitlements programs, that's going to have to be part of the savings. But we argue that the U.S., to achieve this goal like the Swiss, we're going to have to begin considering some heterodox fiscal policies. And this would include selling some federal assets. The target there would be the $55 billion in resources held on federal land. We think that what we propose is a new Homestead Act like the 19th century. We would have to transfer resources, land and mineral resources, back to the states, privatize, devolution, let the states manage resources. We do a much better job in Colorado than the federal government. We've been balancing the budget. We, by the way, have the Tabor Amendment, as Romina said, and it's a Swiss debt brake. For 2 decades, we've been limiting the growth of spending to inflation and population growth. Surplus is used to pay off our debt. Citizens in Colorado vote on taxes and debt at every level of government. We have, in fact, shown that it can work for 2 decades. In fact, what I propose to Jan Edgard is that Colorado become a Swiss canton. We think we'd be a lot better in Switzerland than we are in the U.S. But he didn't take me up on that. So, at any rate,
have the mountains.
So you're right.
Yeah, thank you.
I think Barry raises a very important point, which is there's almost 2 separate issues here. If we were starting from a place of fiscal sanity today, what fiscal rule could we introduce to ensure that over the next few decades we maintained fiscal discipline and kept the debt to GDP ratio at a relatively low level? Unfortunately, we're not in that position. So we're kind of discussing what you do in an ideal world, but then we have to take into consideration the context in which we find ourselves and just how difficult it's going to be to even get to a stage where a rule like this would bind in the first place. US federal debt now is around the same level it was after the Second World War, except that this time we're not going to be able to institute big cuts to military expenditure because of the end of the war. And lots of the spending is now real demands on government, real demands on redistribution, which can't be inflated away. Social security and things like that, which are index linked. So it's much more difficult, the situation that we're in today, and very different context from any debt period that we've faced in the past. And that's why the recent budget deal was so disappointing. I was marginally in favor of the tax package, though recognizing that it would have a negative impact on the debt outlook, because I thought that tax reform, genuine tax reform, including the reform of the corporate tax system, required tax cuts. It's very, very difficult to reform taxes in a meaningful way in an environment where you're not cutting taxes, because you create too many losers who offset the winners, and the losers tend to be those who shout loudest. So I was in favour of that, but recognising it was going to probably have a negative consequence on the debt outlook. But what the Republicans should have done at that stage is come out to voters going into this year and said, look, if you like your tax cuts and want to keep your tax cuts, then vote Republican, and we're going to try to implement some degree of fiscal restraint in the coming years. They haven't done that, and now we're in a situation where, by all accounts, it looks like that the deficit in the next couple of years is going to go up to somewhere between 5 and 5.5% of GDP, which is, really, really unprecedented for a long period of peacetime without a major recession for a decade. So we need to get ourselves into a position where this kind of rule would even bind and make sense, and we're a long way from that. Yeah, in one of my articles I wrote that the remaining Republicans who still preach fiscal discipline preach it like St. Augustine. They say, Lord, give me fiscal discipline, but not yet. And that seems to be the position we're in. I thought that we could get to a position where we're talking about a balanced budget over a 5-year period. Given recent changes in policy, I think that's hugely over-optimistic. And now we're looking at a 10 to 15-year period, I think, and even that would be pretty stringent in terms of restraining spending. So context here really does matter for thinking about these types of rules for the longer term.
I'm glad you raised the topic of Social Security and also the rising healthcare expenditures that are driving much of the growth in federal spending in the United States and also in the debt. If we look at the next 10 years, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which are the big federal healthcare programs, and interest on the debt are projected to drive 85% of the projected growth in spending. So that's the additional spending that we're looking at over the next 10 years. And with the separation of powers and responsibilities that we see in the very federal system in Switzerland, I'm not as familiar with it, but I believe, if not all, but most of the healthcare spending happens at the canton level. So not very much on the federal level. So that's a key difference. And healthcare is really the primary driver for us in terms of increasing spending. But then there's also, isn't there also a general revenue transfer for the Social Security program in the Swiss system, where some of the federal revenues, I think a percentage of the value-added tax, and then there's other earmarked funds that help finance a portion of their Social Security pension programs. It would seem to me that transfer in particular could be affected by the Swiss debt break. And so I'm wondering whether Switzerland is also facing similar demographic challenges as the United States, and what that means for the Swiss debt break going forward. If you could talk a little bit about the federal and also the cantonal level, where they do face the healthcare cost pressures as well. What can we expect? Is this a fiscal rule that is going to be able to work in the long run and be able to be sustained given the demographic pressures that our country and also Switzerland may be facing?
Yes, you made a very excellent description as of what the current discussions from this angle are in Switzerland. We obviously have the same kind of problems as most industrialized countries have, namely demography-wise. We see people getting older. We see at the same time their wishes for better medical care is increasing substantially. So you're right, these are also in Switzerland those items which are bound to increase in the years to come, so to speak. And it is already the case that the pension scheme is partly being financed through tax money, so to speak. My prediction is that this is going to be increased further. Unfortunately, last autumn in September, we had a political proposal, a compromise, so to speak, as of how to reform the pension scheme system. That got voted down by the population, despite the fact that the parties in general were in favor of that, and it was a political compromise. This actually means that the potential problem has increased even further, because it probably takes a couple of years before we have a new proposal as of how to reform that particular part of Social Security system, which at the federal level is the most worrisome part, so to speak. For the years to come, for the next 5 years, I'm pretty confident that this will not have any large consequences for the debt brake system itself. But of course, if we don't find another solution, a type of a debt brake on this part of the Social Security system as well, then this might be something worrisome in the years after that. You're absolutely right. You're also right that at the cantonal level, the Medicare situation is the most worrisome part. Most of the hospitals are, at least to quite some extent, being financed through cantonal money. There is certainly an oversupply of hospitals in Switzerland, but given the cantonal level at which this is being done, there is also this kind of political competition. No canton wants to cut on these kind of hospitals, because the society, the population favors hospitals in their own vicinity, which I completely understand, but it reduces the potential of concentration, of specialization in these kinds of hospitals. There will be reforms needed there as well in the decades to come, so to speak. This is all not extremely urgent as compared to what I see in other countries happening, but of course the problems are, in a sense, similar.
Yeah. And Barry and Ryan, if you could maybe also talk a little bit about what kind of whether any fiscal rule the U.S. adopts should basically exclude the primary drivers like Social Security and healthcare, or how they could be incorporated to incentivize reforms in those programs. Because it seems to me automatic spending reductions can be effective to some degree if we were able to include some automatic stabilizers, such as indexing eligibility ages, for example, to life expectancy, which some countries have done. But what kind of how do you envision a fiscal rule in the United States? How would it address those key pressures from healthcare and Social Security?
Well, I'd like to respond, but I had a question for John Egbert. You mentioned that in Switzerland, you adjust the premiums for Social Security cyclically. I wondered if you could explain that.
No, not cyclically, but in the sense that if the debt in this particular part of the Social Security system becomes too large, reaches a certain kind of threshold, then there is an automatic principle that the Social Security premiums are going to be increased as well. Yes. So in that sense, it's not cyclical, but it's basically a threshold when the debt in that particular part of the system reaches a certain level.
Okay. Yeah, I think that in terms of where we go from here with our Social Security system and healthcare system, I think the crucial decision would be to, first of all, get some constraints on total spending. I think if we could get an effective fiscal rule constraining discretionary spending, then we'd have a much stronger case to go and begin making the reforms in Social Security and Medicare and so forth. And I should also emphasize, we have a track record of reform. Jeb Bush, I think, was very on the frontier of Medicaid reform in Florida and enacted some reforms that did reduce costs, maintain quality of care, relying more heavily on a private medical delivery system and competition for insurance and so forth. So it's not as if we don't have a precedent for successful reform, but it's a question of translating that to the national level.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, Romina, but I don't know the answer to this question. So if you were to add up, I think there's, well, first of all, I'd say people try to separate these issues as, trying to balance the books in the shorter term and then the long-term debt outlook, and that's, as we all know, primarily driven by entitlements. But to me, they're one and the same problem to a large extent, because if you add up total healthcare spending, Social Security spending, and debt interest, what proportion of total spending is that? I'd imagine it's pretty high, right?
It's about 55% of the budget. Yeah,
55% of the budget. And then
close to 60 soon.
it's pretty clear that for political reasons, defense is largely protected as well. So you get all of those aspects in, and we had a similar experience in the UK when we were trying to eliminate the budget deficit. And you ring fence between 70 and 80% of the budget, and you have to have huge cuts in most other areas of government activity to get anywhere near even balance in the books. And then, of course, in the longer term, the longer you leave that problem becomes more difficult because these items take up an even greater share of total spending. So I think it's important to get going on this sooner rather than later. I'm of the view that as much spending as possible should be in any spending cap. I think as soon as you start having exemptions, politicians find creative ways to reallocate spending from the non-exempt to exempt functions. Countries do this by exempting infrastructure spending, for example, and then define government consumption spending as infrastructure spending. They do it on defense, where they call foreign aid spending defense spending, and they find all sorts of weird and wonderful ways of circumventing the rules. So the first thing, I think you have to have as much spending as possible within the framework of the rule, because that's clear, that's observable, and that keeps political feet to the fire. But even if the US had a Swiss-style rule, I still think you need a secondary type of rule, and that's because the Swiss rule talks about the year ahead. But because the long-term debt crisis is driven by entitlements, you have to have some restrictions on politicians today increasing the generosity of entitlements for tomorrow and getting elected on that basis. This again was a problem that we had in the UK, where the government came in promising a deficit reduction plan, but one of the first things it did was increase the generosity of the state pension by linking pension increases each year to the higher of inflation, wage growth, or 2.5%, practically guaranteeing that pension spending would go up and up and up over time. So those two, I think, refinements, as much spending as possible within the framework of the rule to stop creative accounting, and a supplementary rule to this to stop politicians today from being over generous with with future taxpayers' money as well.
We have some time for questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I will call on you. Our friendly intern, Alec, will come by. He will hold on to the microphone. He will not let go of it. And if you would please phrase your question as a question and not as an extended comment, we would appreciate it. In the back.
Hi, thank you all so much. My question is about sort of the critiques that we get all the time from policymakers as to why something like this isn't politically feasible. So the argument that we hear is that, you know, Switzerland is relatively homogeneous. They don't deal with, say, hurricanes or natural disasters with the same frequency. They don't have the military footprint around the world that we do in the United States. And so we always have these sort of emergency needs that might not be able to be accounted for by a sort of stringent rule. So I wonder if you could address how the particular needs of United States spending that may exist could be sort of compatible with a rule like we've been talking about.
Well, of course, it is true that Switzerland is, because of its size, must be more homogeneous than the United States is. That's a fact. Nevertheless, in the Swiss debt brake system, there is a way in which these kind of additional spending, which are extraordinary, which were not scheduled, which were not planned, are allowed for. This rarely happens, partly because of the nature of Switzerland, that's true, but it's at least there. We know that, for instance, during the great financial crisis, there was a discussion in Parliament whether they should actually need the fiscal capacity to stimulate the economy during 2009. And actually, that wasn't really needed because, again, the size matters here. Switzerland is so small. It was basically affected through the foreign situation, export, imports. The exchange rate policy was much more important back then than anything done domestically. So actually, they retrained from that. But in principle, it would have been possible. It would have been possible for the two chambers in Parliament to say, okay, now this is an extreme situation. We need the additional money. right now, and we spend it on that and that. Of course, it then also implies that in the 6 years to come, because there is a time frame of 6 years, they must find a way in which this money is being paid back. Yes, so that's the cost side, so to speak. It's not like it's freewheeling money lying around. No, we can spend it today, but then we have to pay it back within a certain number of years.
So you keep a record of that extraordinary spending, and with that in mind, I think it could very much apply to the United States too, and we could still do the emergency spending necessary, and then pay it back over time and factor that in. Over here.
Thank you. Kurt Couchin with Defense Priorities. First, I want to let everyone know that the Law Library of Congress produced a report translating the relevant provisions of the Swiss Constitution and statute into English. So it's a great resource. It's only 7 or 8 pages. And related to that, so I think it's Article 13. It kind of gives the basic rule, you know, the countercyclical spending targeting. Could we adapt that in a way that uses sort of the compensation and the amortization accounts, but uses a different kind of rule? Getting to balance seems like it'd be really hard to do anytime soon, but maybe something like debt to GDP targeting or growing at a Tabor style rate, something like that. Is that something that could be melded into that structure?
Well, the way I would think about this is introduce another, as I would label it, Kfactor. We had this cyclical correction factor, the K in my little formula, which basically depends upon potential output and actual output. But you can also have a Kfactor, or let's call it, well, a B factor, whatever name you give it, which allows for a certain deficits in particular years, which might slowly disappear over time. So you simply multiply the very simple formula I showed you with something new or something additional for which you can design additional rules. Yes. How quickly do you want this deficit to disappear? Do you need 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? So you make a linear scheme of this B factor, which then at some stage in time becomes simply 1. That would be my very simple way of trying to deal with that.
I should say that in the fiscal rules that John Merrifield and I designed, we do build an emergency fund into the fiscal rules. They're very similar to the Swiss rules. And the way our emergency fund works is that in periods of rapid economic growth where you have 10 years of growth and average growth and the actual growth is above the 10-year average, then the rules require that a portion of surplus revenue above the spending limit be transferred to an emergency fund. In a period of slower growth where the actual growth is below the 10-year trend, then you would be free to transfer that emergency fund to the general fund to finance spending and offset revenue shortfalls. So, as John Egbert said, you can design these fiscal rules to adjust for emergency spending.
Ryan, did you want to add something as well?
Yeah, well, different countries have kind of done different things. I totally accept the point that you're making, that you need a deficit reduction plan before you even get to a stage where this this exact rule could actually operate and bind in the US. What other countries that had higher debt levels did, which is a slightly different question. So Chile, rather than targeting structural balance each year, for the first few years of operation of its rule, targeted a structural surplus of 1% of GDP. They then lowered that to 0.5% of GDP, and when they got to a stage where basically their net debt was 0, then they operated full structural balance from there. So there are kind of adjustments that you can make depending on whether you're trying to reduce the deficit as a first step to achieving long-run fiscal sustainability, or indeed trying to get your debt to GDP ratio down first.
The gentleman with the yellow tie first, or golden tie? Thank you.
Does, excuse me, does the Swiss debt break create a bias in favor of spending cuts over tax increases as the primary means for eliminating a deficit?
I don't really see why. No, it's not my feeling. It's my feeling that if indeed in the Swiss political system there are good reasons for increasing taxes, it is possible. Maybe you're right that it's a little bit more difficult to increase taxes, given that most likely, if this is an important tax which you're talking about. This has to go for the population. It has to be voted upon, but also bigger spending classes probably have to go through a referendum as well nowadays. So in that sense, I think this is quite balanced.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. It's not so much the debt break itself, but the other institutional framework whereby you have to, the major tax rises have to be asserted through referenda. One thing that I would say though, is that whilst we all would like lower spending, or most of us in this room, I imagine, would like lower spending and lower taxes, I think that in order to get maximum amount of political buy-in for any rule of this description, we can't have it biased one way or another towards spending and against tax rises. I think if you're ever going to get to a political consensus for fiscal sustainability, you have to have a rule that's neutral on the size of government. Switzerland obviously has other protections in there in terms of the way the constitution deals with certain taxes, and we can always talk about supplementary rules, or different rules which would constrain tax rates. But I think if you're going to try and build a coalition behind this sort of responsible reform, it has to be neutral between taxes and spending.
Yes, Baker Spring with the Compact for America. For Mr. Sturm, one of the things that we face here as we're looking forward is that at the end of the current 10-year budget period, we're talking about interest costs that may exceed $1 trillion. Can you give us some idea of the scope of what the success in Switzerland had in terms of controlling the government's interest costs?
That's a difficult question to come up with examples which portray that. I think it's again the way the system works. It's not just a debt break which describes how processes go about in Switzerland. It's very difficult to come up now with a very clear example which highlights this particular point. So.
But we do know that Switzerland has some of the lowest interest costs than any other government, and in part is because Swiss debt is scarce. It's declining.
It's actually an argument which some people bring at the moment. We had a number of years in which the government bond yield was negative. So there were arguments, why not invest right now? And then indeed the politicians said, well, we're willing to invest, but come up with decent projects. Yes, we do need a decent return, which match with that. We don't simply invest because of the sake of investing. And actually there has been reports out there which show that the infrastructure in Switzerland is pretty well. So there is no real need at the moment, despite the very low cost associated to raising funds, of spending more on infrastructure. It's an exceptional situation, but...
There are examples of other countries that say when Chile committed to its fiscal rule in the early 2000s, it did see a significant decline in its borrowing costs, and rated agencies improved Chile's outlook and Chile's rating. And recently, when they've kind of abandoned the stringent rule that they'd implemented, they've seen a decline in their credit rating as well. So this stuff does matter.
Oh, we can take one more question right here in the middle.
Sure. John Radman, I'm a Heritage member, and my question is about a balanced budget amendment. And I was wondering, is it worth pursuing a balanced budget amendment for to resolve some of the issues that you have identified here with respect to the deficits and the debt?
Sure.
I think it's important to emphasize that, in fact, the Swiss have a combination of fiscal rules. As John Egbert said, they have a balanced budget rule, balanced in the near term over the business cycle. And that is linked to and part of the debt break. So the debt break is really an expenditure rule that's designed to achieve the balanced budget and achieve those targets. So we have a balanced budget amendment. Of course, it's ignored. And so it's a statutory measure.
You mean in Colorado or
I mean
at the federal level?
The federal level. We have a balanced budget amendment as a constitutional measure in Colorado that's also linked to our constitutional Tabor Amendment, and that is the most effective combination. I think if you have a constitutional provision requiring a balanced budget and an expenditure limit like Tabor or a Swiss debt break, that has proven to be the most effective set of fiscal rules you can design. Now, the problem at the federal level, of course, is we don't have initiative and referendum. What we do have is Article 5. And my expectation is that Congress is not going to suddenly this year pass a Swiss debt brake. That may surprise you. But I think that the best prospect is for us to go to the states, have our state legislators take the initiative, and begin enacting a balanced budget amendment through the Article 5 Amendment Convention. The Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force has taken an active role in this. David Biddulph, who's head of that, is here in our audience. And we have 28 states have passed a resolution calling for a balanced budget amendment. We're working on 6 more states. We think we're going to get another 6 states over the next year or so. And I think that that's probably the best prospect for us to get a balanced budget amendment. And of course, what we will do, hopefully, is combine this. We need a set of fiscal rules that links a balanced budget amendment in our Constitution with statutory rules like the Swiss debt brake. And I think that combination, we can turn the country around.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's the right aim. What I would say is that it's got to be a smart, balanced budget amendment of the same similar nature to Switzerland's. It's got to be really about structural balance over the economic cycle, and there's different ways that you can go about achieving that. But broadly, that should be the aim. I think a balanced budget amendment, which meant zero borrowing year on year, would be completely politically and economically impossible. So there's the process. How do you get to a stage where we're actually able to implement a balanced budget amendment? But also it's important for the details as well. It's got to be a structural balanced budget amendment. And I think it should also be overwhelmingly focused, because this is what the government can actually control, on capping expenditure as opposed to targeting deficits per se.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this very timely and important discussion. We've run out of time, and I think that we'll hear more about these issues, especially next week when the Congressional Budget Office releases its outlook for the United States. So thank you for your support of fiscal responsibility, and thank you for being here with us today. And thank you to my panel. Please thank me in thanking them for joining us today.